After doing the short about John the Baptist's influence on Jesus, it occurred to me that there's so much more to be said about John the Baptist than could fit in 30 seconds of a slideshow, so I decided to make this video here. John the Baptist, to the vast majority of the world's Christians, was like Jesus the prequel. Okay, his entire purpose was to kind of prime the people to be ready to accept Jesus. But historically, we know that wasn't the case. John the Baptist was his own entity. He had his own following, many times larger than Jesus's. And I think, I'm not exactly certain when John's following was overtaken by Jesus's following, but it was quite a bit down the road. We see this in the New Testament when one of Paul's mission trips over to Turkey. When he gets there, he already finds followers of John the Baptist there. So it was a large movement. It was a big enough movement to have attracted the attention of the king, who was not at all happy because the audience was willing to do whatever John told them to. And this, of course, was not optimum when you're trying to keep order in the kingdom, especially if, the charismatic leader didn't happen to be a fan of your behavior. Okay, so the idea that John the Baptist had a ministry and then handed it off to Jesus once Jesus shown up to get baptized is wrong. Okay, it even says, we read about it in the book of John, where Jesus comes along and asks to be baptized. And remember, some of the Gospels do put this fact in that John hesitated. John did not want to baptize Jesus. Now, this also makes up part of the narrative held by the Mandaeans, who hold John the Baptist as being their principal prophet and Jesus as being not a prophet. They also say that John hesitated. But we'll look at that in a little bit. So in John, we find out what historically we believe to be the case, that Jesus came to John. While he was talking to John, he met a few of other followers of John, who later became Jesus' disciples. But Jesus asked to be baptized into John's ministry, into communion with John. John apparently acquiesces, and then they divide and conquer. So John continues baptizing up north, and Jesus is sent down into Judea to go baptize. So Jesus and John split apart, working for a common goal. And the common goal was not Jesus being the Messiah. It was John's ministry. We also get a sampling of that too. After John was imprisoned, he sends a couple of his disciples to go hunt down Jesus because John had heard that Jesus was now claiming to be the one everyone had been waiting for. And they press Jesus in front of his followers, in front of the crowd, and they rattle him pretty deeply because he would not answer their questions directly. They asked, "So are you the one we've been waiting for?" Now Jesus, in response, praises John and says, basically, look at what I've done. Look at this, look at that. But he will not give them an answer. And of course, as John's followers are leaving to go back to detail what they have heard to their teacher, Jesus, of course, is praising John. And of course, he utters that of all men born of women, none is greater than John. Of course, Jesus was also born of a woman. This was essential. Jesus could not have the public think that there was a rift between Jesus and the mighty John the Baptist. Because if that was the case, if word got out that John and Jesus were disagreeing heavily on something, I don't think Jesus' movement would have been able to get off the ground. Now, I know what I'm going to hear, that the Gospels, John says this, and that I must decrease so that Christ may increase. and that John was there preparing the way. But we just know that historically that's not how it went. Keep in mind, once again, this is going to be a recurrent theme when we're studying the history of Christianity, that the Gospels weren't newspapers. Okay, this wasn't being written by the people around as the events were happening. Okay, these were written by communities of Christians as conversion materials, as a way of putting down their beliefs in order to spread their beliefs to others. Okay, so Mark wrote his first, and other groups, other communities of Christians would read Mark and add what they felt was important to it. They edit it and adjust what their knowledge of Jesus was, and so forth. Okay, and these were written, the Gospels themselves were not written for several decades after the death of both Jesus and John the Baptist. Okay, so there's a phenomenon happening. When you read the Gospels in the order in which they were written, you see John fading away in importance. Okay, he gets less and less and less. And of course, this is because if you are a group of Christians and you're basically competing against other groups for followers, you don't want to blow up the other guy very much. Okay, it was undeniable in the local history there that John the Baptist was a huge deal and that Jesus was attached to John the Baptist. But each successive gospel does its part to kind of minimize John and slide everyone over to Jesus. Now, in the Christian community nowadays, there's this idea that John was out there preaching, Jesus showed up, and John and all John's followers converted and followed Jesus. And then from there, Christianity just basically remained the same and moved forward. But that's not at all true. John the Baptist had a huge following all over the place and was evangelizing. It was spreading throughout the empire. Jesus came along, and after John was taken out of the picture, Jesus kind of went his own way. He went from helping John to more or less being John with a message of his own. Okay, now that message was first taken by the Nazarenes, the apostles of Jesus that were there with Jesus the whole time, and they formed their group of believers that were following the teachings of Jesus. Now, this guy named Paul comes from somewhere else and makes his own version of this. And in the popularity contest, that's the one that won. And that it's been passed down to where it is today. But John the Baptist's followers did not just disappear. They stuck around. And for a while there, Jesus' followers, Paul's followers, John the Baptist's followers, and the Jews of the day were all sharing interactions at the synagogue. They were all still part of the same religion. Okay, now John's followers, I wish there was more scholarship about them, but there is a group today called the Mandaeans who hold John to be their principal prophet, and their version of events, it agrees with what's found in the New Testament up to the point of John getting put in prison, basically. It has Jesus come up to John and asked him to baptize him, and John doesn't want to because he thinks Jesus is doing this for the wrong reasons. He doesn't find him worthy, but Jesus pressures him, and eventually John does baptize him into the movement. But as their movement continues, they later label Jesus as being a deceiver, someone that corrupted John's message for his own gain. So we kind of see, this wasn't just cut and dry, that all of this popular prophet's followers got taken over by Jesus and then went forward. That's not at all what happened. And we don't see it in Josephus either. Josephus writes more about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus. And certainly, if John the Baptist had converted to the Jesus movement when he was alive, somebody would have mentioned that, because that would have been horrible for the governments at the time, for the the Jewish temple and for the Romans. There was no way that they would have let that fly. But it didn't happen, okay? They were competing prophets. They were competing messages. And I understand at the time, when John and Jesus were together, this would have made sense to the Jews of the age because they were awaiting not one Messiah, but two. One from a kingly line and one from a priestly line. And this would have appeared very much to many of the people around that Jesus and John fit this description. Now, one more thing. I mean, we traditionally like to call John Jesus' cousin, but we don't really know what he was. We know that Jesus and John were related through their mothers. And that's about it. Cousin seems like a good fit, but it wasn't actually named in the source material. So, cousin seems fine, but I just thought I'd throw that out there as a bit of trivia that we don't know for sure if they were cousins. Okay, so the moral of this whole thing here is that John is more than just a flavoring particle for Jesus. Only in the Christian New Testament does John fold his movement and get behind Jesus. Every other source outside of that did not happen. And John's movement continued even beyond the Baptist death. His movement propagated forth in parallel with Jesus's, or with Paul's, and with the Jerusalem church, with the Nazarenes. So all of them were competing, basically, for supremacy, and especially after the fall of the temple. Once that happened, the entire Judaism, the entire religion changed, and they were all competing to be the way. And so, yeah, there was a time there when they were all competing against each other. And so, now does that mean that Jesus is not the Messiah? No, it doesn't mean that at all. All we're saying is that historically, it was a lot more complicated than what the New Testament recorded, decades after the death of both of the men.